I heard the screaming before I even opened my car door, and for a second I thought maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. It wasn't the kind of scream movies give you all high and sharp. It was this raw, worn-out sound like someone had been yelling for so long they'd run out of voice and yet they couldn't stop. I parked and my hand was still on the gear shift before I knew why my body was moving. That sound sank into my ribs before my head had time to name it. And I sat there for 2 stupid seconds, engine ticking the neighborhood quiet, in that small, ordinary way suburbs pretend they are safe. And then something clicked, and I was out of the car. My feet moved before my brain caught up, like they had rehearsed this exact stumble toward catastrophe 100 times. It was coming from down the driveway from the narrow strip beside our neighbor's garage, the place you never think about unless you're either pushing a mower or hiding something you're embarrassed for people to find. The air smelled like hot concrete and cut grass, and there crumpled against the cinder block was Camille. She'd been coming to my house every other Tuesday for 6 years. Same blue tote bag with the zipper that never worked right. She always promised she'd fix it, never did. She knew my kids' birthdays, left little notes when she ran out of bleach, once stayed 3 extra hours when a pipe burst at midnight and didn't charge me a penny. Camille was the kind of person who remembered the small things, and when you meet people like that, they kind of become family without the fuss. When I slammed on that garage door and called her name, the sound stopped. There was this second of silence that felt like the calm before a tidal wave. Then, in a voice that trembled between exhaustion and rage, she said, "I'm in here. Please help me." It was so thin she might have saved those words for an emergency, and then barely had the air to share them. I am not a confrontational guy. I return grocery items to the wrong aisle because I don't want to leave them where they might offend someone. I smile at people who ignore me. I avoid conflict like it's bad weather, dress warm and stay inside. So what I did next surprised me as much as it probably surprised anyone watching. There was a padlock on the side door, one of those over-the-top locks people put on when they want the world to know they mean business. I remember thinking, who locks a human being in a garage on a Tuesday? I wandered the yard like someone trying to buy time, and then grabbed a landscaping rock from a flower bed, the kind you shouldn't really take, but you do anyway when you're not thinking about decor. 2 hits, 2 ugly snaps, the padlock split like a lie, and the door swung open. The smell hit me first, hot, stale air that had been trapped for hours. The light felt sharp and mean when it cut into that little space. Camille was on the concrete, knees to her chest, tears dried in streaks, her eyes squinting as if she'd been in the dark a very long time. When she saw me, her face folded and she started to cry all over again. But this time it was the soft kind of crying that makes your throat hurt just from hearing it. I crouched and put my hand on her shoulder because I needed to anchor her back to reality, to let her know I was there and that the world outside her garage still existed. She breathed against my palm like a boat finding shore. And then I looked up. Linda was at the door between the garage and her house, arms crossed, that narrow, practiced smile she wore like armor. You've met a Linda before, or at least I have. She'd been our HOA president for 9 years, which in this neighborhood is a long time. Long enough to collect grudges, long enough to write people into little files of quiet disapproval. She tended her shrubbery with the same intensity she tended neighborly business. Everything measured, everything noted, everything judged. On the first day Camille ever came to clean, Linda was outside pretending to do yard work but really policing humanity. By evening there was a handwritten note in my mailbox asking me for proof that my service workers were vetted and permitted. The implication was clear: some people don't belong here unless Linda approves it. Standing there with Camille leaning on me and Linda framed in the doorway, something cold settled in my chest. This was not petty HOA stuff. This was a person, human, breathing, broken, locked, where she could have died from heat or panic. I remember saying slow and low, "Don't you move," and then dialing 911. When you call for help in a situation like that, you realize how much of the modern world runs on recorded words. I needed a record, someone to hear what was happening, timestamp it, answer later when Linda tried to make sense of her own version. I gave the address. I said the words "unlawful detention," and I kept the dispatcher on the line until officers arrived. Camille got to her feet slowly, each motion careful, like someone who has promised their body it will be okay soon. She said my name once like a talisman, and then quiet. Her hands shook in a way that didn't match the relief on her face. It matched the kind of biological panic that needs hours to unwind. The cops arrived in 11 minutes. I checked my phone more than once because time compresses in confrontations, and I wanted the number nailed to my memory. Two officers even voices professional. They treated Camille first, calling for a medic because of heat exposure and high heart rate. They assessed the scene with that flat face people get trained to wear. Then they turned to Linda. And this is where the story took one of those sharp turns, the part that should have made the whole thing so much simpler. Linda didn't look like someone who had acted without thought. She looked like someone who had done the math and had a file to prove it. She talked. She explained with the exact wrong language that she had intercepted Camille, that she had secured the area, that she had documentation of prior incidents. She said it like she expected a round of applause. The officer asked one very simple question: did Camille ask to leave? And Linda, in her perfectly clipped voice, said no. That should have been the end of it. That should have been the point where the consequences were immediate. Instead, Linda's face shifted not to remorse but to strategy. She had rehearsed for this, and she thought she could script the outcome. They didn't handcuff her. They cited her, photographed the lock, took statements. The officers did their job and left a crack in Linda's empire, but not enough to topple it by itself. That had to come from somewhere else. Here's the twist you wouldn't see coming if you thought of our block as a single-color painting teenagers. One of them, Ethan, had set up a doorbell camera the week before to prove his sister wasn't the one who left muddy footprints on their stoop. He was bored, he was nosy, and he had footage of Linda clear as daylight closing the garage and locking it behind her. He gave the clip to another neighbor, and then someone put it in an email to the HOA board, and suddenly the neat little files Linda kept had a crack. People talk about power as if it's weight you can feel, but it's quieter than that. Power survives on silence. Linda had run this street on the quiet that people give when they don't want conflict, on the polite avoidance that lets small tyrannies fester. That camera clip was a tiny, ugly act of rebellion, and it changed the room. Evidence shifted the mood. The officer's polite neutrality met a different kind of response when video framed the story. Camille pressed charges. Neighbors filled the HOA meeting like they were queuing for something big. But what we wanted was simple accountability. The vote was brutal in its simplicity, 9-2. Linda was removed from her position. She moved out months later, which is the external kind of karma. People like to see a physical relocation, a rupture in the quiet she'd thrived on. 8 months later. Outside a courthouse, Camille took a breath like someone exhaling after holding water out of her lungs. Her smile was small but real. She still works for me. Same blue tote, new zipper this time, and she parks wherever she wants because that's how this ended: ordinary restoration, not a parade. Linda left, but what really stayed with me was how close we were to silence that would have swallowed everything. Think about that. How many times does something awful go on because no one wants to be the one to step forward? Power doesn't always flash. It feeds on quiet, on the little choices to look away, to say nothing, to assume someone else will handle it. I'd like to think I would have acted sooner if I'd known. The truth is, I almost didn't. I almost let the scream become background noise because I didn't want to make a scene. The moral is not some glossy packaged lesson. It's this: empathy is kinetic. It requires action. It isn't enough to feel horrified and then tuck that feeling away until it eases. There's an accountability that lives in doing something small, breaking a lock, calling a number, handing a file to a neighbor. Those things add up. They turn the quiet into noise loud enough to get institutions to listen. I won't pretend it's heroic. I was scared, stiff-kneed, trembling with the idea that stepping between two people could make things worse. I fumbled. I used a landscaping rock like some amateur hero in a suburban drama. But I also kept my voice steady on the phone because sometimes the most effective thing you can offer in chaos is a clear sentence that will be found in a report later. If there's one scene I can't scrub from my head, it's how the whole street watched Linda walk back into her house, and no one looked away. 9 years of her ruling had been this unspoken compact. She administered the rules and people complied in tiny ways. That silence had been her crown. Watching her leave without that crown felt like a collective exhausted exhale. So here we are, a woman freed, a neighbor displaced, a community slightly altered. Camille still shows up every other Tuesday. She brings that tote and her steady kindness, and when she laughs now, it's lighter, like a door finally opened properly. Linda is a story people tell when they talk about what happens when small power goes unchecked. And me, I learned to pay attention to the sounds that make you move. Tell me, where do you draw the line between vigilance and overreach? When does enforcing a rule become enforcing your will on another person? I want to know what you think is justice in moments like this. Share your story. Tell me a time you stepped in or didn't, and what you learned. If there's anything left of this little mess of a tale, it's this: don't let your silence be someone else's power.